Well, welcome everybody again, and it gives me the very greatest of pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Haig Utidjian. Dr. Utidjian is a lecturer in Armenian Studies at Charles University in Prague, where he also serves as the chief conductor of the university chorus and orchestra. After a BSc and MSc at Sussex and Imperial, Dr. Utidjian received his doctorate from Charles University in Prague in 2016. His thesis analysing the music of the Armenian hymnal through the Tumtsasan corpus. He has published widely on different aspects of musicology and in fact situates his research at the intersection, at the crossroads of musicology, philology, theology and Armenian studies. This afternoon, he's going to be introducing us to some of the findings of some very recent research, and the paper's title for this evening is On the Words and Music of the Odes of St. Gregory of Narek. Dr. Utidjian, welcome.
Thank you so very much, Timothy, for the kind introduction and for the kind invitation. It is a great pleasure and honor to give this presentation, albeit from a certain distance, that can't be helped. I shall now proceed to share my screen, if I may. And trust that it is readily visible. Do I take it that my screen is now indeed visible?
Yes, it is.
Splendid. So my topic is one that is close to my heart, namely the Odes of St. Gregory of Narek, and I have made a point of stressing that it is the words as well as the music associated with those miniatures that I should like to talk about. For anyone who may not yet know of St. Gregory of Narek, he was an Armenian saint. He was a monk who spent most of his life in a monastery in the village of Nareg, virtually on the shores of Lake Van during the second half of the 10th century. We're not quite sure exactly when he was born, but the generally recognized date for his passing is the year 1003. Interest in his writings has happily greatly increased, not least as a result of the fact that Pope Francis, back in 2015, in the course of a rather splendid service at St. Peter's, declared St. Gregory of Narek a doctor of the Universal Church, amongst such luminaries such as St. Thomas Aquinas or Augustine. And more recently, he also adopted the date of the 27th of February as a feast day devoted to the veneration of the saint. The Armenian Church also celebrates him in early October as well. But it is really very much to be welcomed that he has recently entered into the consciousness of a far wider potential readership than was the case until relatively recently. He is primarily known for a very beautifully written and rather poetic penitential prayer book, usually referred to as the Book of Lamentation. That has tended to overshadow his other writings, and it is perhaps a pity. The Book of Lamentation does indeed include rather somber prayers and reflections, elegies, if you like, and the main theme is one of profound regret and repentance, a profound awareness of the tragedy of beautiful divine gifts to humankind, having been spoilt by sin. It is a theme that we find particularly beautifully expressed by church fathers such as St. Gregory of Nyssa, and yet it is not all lamentation. There's a constant tension between grief on the one hand and hope. And indeed, at one point, there's a rather characteristic statement which says that even if we were to roll down and sink into the depths of the precipice, you show us the heavens, addressing God in so doing. So somehow St. Gregory associates himself. There are a lot of scriptural references as well as latent allusions, and he virtually takes upon himself all the sins committed by all sorts of characters from the Old Testament particularly, but also from the New, not necessarily having committed those sins himself personally, but as a means of allowing his work to serve as a useful manual, as a handbook almost, that will be helpful to any sinners. As it were, he tries to reach the reader from whichever depths the reader may have found himself and raises him up. And indeed, he's very ambitious because he seeks nothing less than unification with God. Divinization, again, it's an idea that we find in church fathers from Irenaeus and St. Athanasius and various others about God having become man so that humankind, may become as God. There's again a very characteristic sentence in the author's commentary on the Song of Songs. He says, "For by the same token whereby he who approaches something that is fragrant becomes fragrant himself, likewise he who comes close to God becomes divine." And another aspect of his writings is a different sort of tension, the tension between apophaticism, a kind of mysticism, a recognition of the fact that the human mind is insufficiently equipped to achieve an understanding of the essence of God, and that therefore it behoves us to adopt what is known as a negative path. Given that we cannot purport to know or understand what God is, we may proceed by specifying what God is not, since God is above being itself. And yet that has to be balanced. If that were taken to extremes, it would lead to nihilism. And St. Gregory is as aware of that danger as many other writers. And so there is a balance struck with the fact that whilst on the one hand we cannot know the nature of God, on the other hand God became man and through the incarnation revealed himself and became a historical figure, a tangible figure. So basically that leads us to scripture, which the author permeates his writings with. And there is one other thing that is noteworthy, perhaps rather ahead of his time. St. Gregory is very, very universal and very ecumenical in his spirit, even a century and a half before St. Narcisse the Gracious, who is known as the main Armenian ecumenical figure of the medieval period. There's universality in the sense that he seems to try very hard to avoid getting involved in potentially controversial matters such as the nature of Christ. And he states explicitly in several places that he hopes that his writings will prove helpful and be used by all nations, young and old, men and women, the rich and the poor, people from all backgrounds, and of course over the future generations as well, that perhaps his writings may induce beneficial tears of repentance in his future readers, and that those tears may mingle with the tears that he's shedding as he's writing, whatever he's writing. A very attractive idea in many ways. Now, I mentioned something about his writings primarily centered on the Book of Lamentation, which is what most people who know of St. Gregory of Narek will have been exposed to some degree. But this afternoon, I should like to focus on his odes. Depending on how you count them, we have about 21 of those. They are fairly short pieces intended to be sung. They are sacred songs. And in contrast to the emphasis on repentance that we find in his other writings, particularly the Book of Lamentation, as I said, the odes are utterly jubilant, ecstatic, and the saint is mystical through poetry, through the deployment of metaphor, all sorts of analogies, allegories, the most rich imagery, full of symbolism. And I think that the author is purposely trying to activate the reader's own imagination and spirituality, because, of course, there are different ways of interpreting some of his writings. In the odes, some of the imagery, some of it is obscure, although now we understand perhaps very much that we could not understand 10 or 15 years ago. And that is primarily due to the efforts of specialists such as Professor Abraham Terian and Professor Mahe. Indeed, we are very fortunate in that many things that were previously considered to be incomprehensible and were attributed to scribal errors have now been clarified. There's a very rich and diverse array of context and meaning in those things, such things like water, trees, light, and these things are juxtaposed in the most delightful way. For example, in the ode celebrating the Holy Transfiguration, there's a play of words in that the Feast of the Holy Transfiguration is called Vartavar in Armenian, which can be interpreted as signifying a rose that has been lit, that is a light. And so he starts the ode by referring to a rose. The rose as a jewel was set alight by the sublime hair of the sun, whereon a sea flower opened out whose color frothed over the all-pervading sea. And it continues much in the same vein. Given that the odes are, as I mentioned, inherently musical pieces, I should like to categorize the sources that are available to us into three types, and they are those. Numated codices, manuscripts that over the verbal text bear certain musical signs, which, alas, in the case of the Armenian tradition, we're not able to decipher. So we are not able to read the Numes or to comprehend precisely what they signified. We know nothing of the mechanisms with which they served to indicate the melody to be sung to contemporaneous users. This particular example does not show an ode at all. It's from a euchologion, a ritual volume, which I was able to photograph in Venice at the Mechitarists monastery. But it's a very nice example because you can clearly see this is the script, this is the verbal text, if you can see my arrow, and those little squiggly things, these signs over the verbal text, they are musical signs, they are Numes. And our oldest sources for the odes of St. Gregory of Nareg are numated. They bear such signs. Much of my research has tried to demonstrate how we can actually derive benefit from those Numes, notwithstanding the fact that we can't decipher them. There is much useful indirect information that they can impart to us with a bit of detective work. And I shall talk about that in a little while, if I may. Now, I should like to say one or two further things about the Numes. We don't know where the Armenian Numes originated from, and we don't even know how old they are. It is quite possible that they may have been in use before the earliest manuscripts we have on which they appear, nor do we know when and why they ceased to be understood. Clearly, catastrophes, large-scale relocations, the destructions of communities as well as monasteries will have played a role, and such events happened throughout Armenian history and sadly appear to be happening before us as I speak. But I think that is not the entire story. I think that a further possible explanation is that whereas we find in many manuscripts that generation after generation, scribes faithfully copied the same neumes from codex to codex, the same musical notation was faithfully transmitted. Nonetheless, it is reasonable to suppose that the creativity of church musicians could not be suppressed. And so we can readily imagine during church services, clerks singing increasingly sophisticated melodies, melodies perhaps that they had themselves composed, melodies that better reflected the taste of their own time, whilst continuing to gaze upon the older neumes, which may have rendered any correspondence between the neumes and the melodies they were actually singing to be rather tenuous. And that may have been responsible for the fact that people went on developing more and more sophisticated melodies to their heart's content, whilst still gazing upon the old notation. And it appears that it wasn't until the 18th century when people started wondering what might the older melodies have been like, presumably melodies that would have corresponded to the medieval neumes. I mentioned that we cannot decipher the neumes, but we are extremely fortunate in that the person whom I myself consider to be the greatest Armenian musicologist of all time, namely Haig Utidjian, a Constantinopolitan church musician, carried out some fundamental research on the neumes and with some ingenious detective work managed not, of course, to decipher the neumes, but he was able to postulate metrical durations for syllables bearing particular neumes or none. So he was able to compare successive stanzas of strophic hymns, and he found that there were certain hymns which had a uniform meter, and stanza after stanza had lines of uniform length, but here and there would be an excess syllable, and conversely, here and there might be a defective line lacking the odd syllable, and in such instances, the numation over such a line would be a little different. There would be one or two neumes other than the ones that were to be found on the other stanzas of the hymn. And he managed to work out conjectural metrical durations associated with the neumes. He also found that certain hymns that were clearly written as prose and not in verse would immediately gain a regular sort of duple meter when metrical values were assigned in accordance to the neumes. So much of this work was done in an ingenious way, and then he found that it agreed with what he observed when he listened to people singing hymns, that often he found that people would indeed linger for two musical beats over a syllable that bore a particular neume, whilst they would pass over another syllable that bore a different sort of neume rather more briefly, and so on and so forth. If you're interested in this sort of work, my monograph on Utidjian's work and what it can help us do in our own time is readily available. But this work can be applied fruitfully to the Odes of St. Gregory of Narek, which is repertoire that Utidjian did not use. He based his conjectures on the Armenian hymnal, which is a different genre. So it is very interesting to see that Utidjian's conjectures are actually very, very fruitful in a different repertoire as well. The second category of source that we've got for the Odes of St. Gregory of Narek are notated in a different notation system that emerged early in the 19th century in Constantinople. And it's associated with the church musician known as Baba Hampartsum Limonjian, although we now know that the Mkhitarist Father Minas Przeszkian, whom you see depicted on the right-hand side, also played a crucial role. And we owe to this notation system the vast majority of what has been preserved of Armenian sacred music in general in our own time. This system is no longer pneumatic. In other words, we no longer have a particular symbol that may represent a particular sequence of notes to be chanted. The principle on which this new system works is rather like tonic sol fa, or it's rather like a Greek Byzantine system devised by Georgios Lesbios, known perhaps slightly unfortunately as the lesbian system. And it is interesting that our Greek colleagues also revised their musical notation at around the same time and in the same Constantinopolitan milieu as the Armenians did. And I was extremely fortunate, and during one of my research trips to Istanbul, I found a manuscript with a group of odes, one of which was this ode, Avedis Meds Chorerto, by St. Gregory of Narek, for which no other melody has been preserved. I can hear some odd sounds emerging from somewhere. Ah, that's better. Thank you. So little discoveries like this can be made even in our own time. And I was naturally delighted. On the right-hand side, you can see my transcription of this, of the opening of the ode. And I even arranged for it to be sung liturgically, and it was a very exciting moment. The glyphs that I used here, I had developed myself with the help of my colleague, Dr. Vladimir Faltus of the Czech Technical University, but they were greatly expanded by my colleague now at Cambridge University, Jacob Oley, and a colleague of his own at the University of Münster. And this is available in the public domain, so if anyone wants it, do please write to me. And of course, the third type of source that we have is that which makes use of Western staff notation. Now, the earliest examples that I know of are little fragments. The one on the left is from 1650, and it is ostensibly an Armenian ode, even though I have not been able to find anything like it anywhere so far, at least. In Musurgia Universalis by the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher. And on the right-hand side, you can see another extremely useful source. It's a textbook of Armenian grammar written in Latin by Johann Joachim Schröder in 1711. It's a very interesting, fascinating volume in all sorts of ways, but it includes the incipits of cantimus hymns. It's a particular type of Armenian traditional hymn performed during nocturnes in the 8 different church modes in Western notation. These are fragments. There are some more, but the first person to start notating Armenian sacred music into Western staff notation on a large scale was the gifted Venetian Italian musician Pietro Bianchini, whose earliest transcriptions date from the year 1855. And in the middle of the slide, you can see a particularly interesting manuscript of his preserved at the Library of Congress. On the right-hand side, there's a very early publication from San Lazzaro, Venice, dating from 1862, which was one of the earliest experiments, and it proved successful. There was some controversy, but it proved successful. And nowadays, in most Armenian churches, you will find singers making use of conventional European notation. And so we have some odes of St. Gregory's preserved in modern Western notation. And I shall give you an example of that in a moment. My initial endeavors were to translate, consisted of translating the odes of St. Gregory of Narek into Czech. And it was only when I embarked on that that I found that some of the texts that were available were really not satisfactory at all. And I started looking at manuscripts. And it became clear to me that it would behove me to endeavor to devise rather more reliable texts before I could engage in translation. So what are the editions that are available? Well, the earliest example that we've got is in, I believe, what is the second oldest Armenian printed book anywhere in existence, published in 1513, and it includes a single ode by St. Gregory of Narek. Then in 1804, we have a mere handful of odes, less than half of them, in a collection published by the Mkhitarist fathers in San Lazzaro. The complete works of the saint were published in 1827, again by the Venetian Mkhitarists, and again in 1840. And in 1840, the collection was more complete on two counts. Some odes that were not known to the fathers in 1827 found their way into the 1840 volume, but also some odes that lacked some stanzas in 1827 were given in a more complete form in 1840. The Soviet-era 1981 edition is of value primarily because it codifies manuscripts that are found at the Madenataran Institute that are not otherwise readily accessible. And she did also make use of a couple of manuscripts at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. My own late lamented teacher, Archbishop Zareh Haznavorian of blessed memory, in his millennial edition of the Saints' complete works of 2003, based his texts mostly on the 1840 Mkhitarist edition, but filling gaps using the Köshgerian 1981 edition. The edition by the late Tamrazian merely reproduces the Köshgerian edition, the Soviet-era edition of 1981, but there's a Kansteder volume published by Devrikian in the Armenian Patrology series, which is interesting in that he made use of a Venice Book of Odes manuscript, amongst others, which Köshgerian did not have access to. So these are the printed sources at our disposal. This is what the Venice 1513 book looks like, and this is the beginning of one of the odes of St. Gregory of Narek. Oddly enough, until recently, it was thought that for this particular ode, this printed source is older than the oldest extant manuscript. The situation changed about 4 years ago with my discovery of manuscripts in Venice that do appear to be older than this, and I shall turn to those a little later. And although the text that is found in this very early publication has been described as being corrupted, which indeed in some ways perhaps it is, but it is extremely useful, and I dare say if people had paid more attention, more careful attention to it, some errors could have been avoided. The San Lazzaro editions are worth having a quick look at. This is the illustrated prayer book, Avotamaduits Patkeras Artial, which, though it has only 8 of the odes, just over a third of them, it should perhaps be regarded as the editio princeps. And Havun Artenatial, the foul awakening, you can see on the right-hand side, so we have only 9 stanzas available of it here. Here, on the top, I've photographed 2 facing pages. The right-hand side page also has the same ode. Above, we've got the 1827 publication. Now, we've got a dozen odes this time. In the Editio Princeps, we had only about 8 of them. And the later edition, at the bottom here, you can see the same ode. It has all 13 stanzas that we know, whereas at the top you can see that it's shorter. We've got only 9 of them. Little changed since the 1840 publication until the publication of the 1981 Soviet era publication. Now, there's a very tantalizing problem with the Mkhitarist Fathers editions, because for many of the manuscript ode books that are kept in San Lazzaro in Venice, and I'm extremely grateful in that the fathers in San Lazzaro have been extremely generous to me in allowing me unfettered access to those treasures. In the catalogue, a very fine and user-friendly catalogue by the late Father Haig Utidjian, usually, wherever known, there is an indication as to the year on which the fathers acquired a particular codex. And so you can piece together, using this information, what the fathers had at their disposal by the years when their 2 editions were published, by 1827 and 1840. And there are surprising observations to be made. One is that they appear to have had manuscripts with fuller texts of odes than they published, even though they already possessed manuscripts that had the particular ode included. And even more intriguingly, in their published editions, there are lines that you find in the odes, verses, passages, readings that are not to be found in any of the manuscripts that were at the disposal of the fathers. How can this be explained? Well, let us remember that during the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, the fathers were acquiring manuscripts at an unprecedented rate. And so they may have had some anthologies at their disposal that they had not yet catalogued, and they had not yet been able to go through all the contents. So their editions in that sense were not necessarily entirely up to date. The second phenomenon is, however, particularly interesting. This piece of paper that I found placed in a much later manuscript nonetheless captures the text of the same ode of which I showed you the opening here, and there's an explanation below it. And it appears that the Mkhitarist fathers had their agents in places like Constantinople, but also throughout historical Armenian lands. And those agents would go from village to village, from monastery to monastery, wherever possible, they would purchase manuscripts and get them sent back to Venice. But when, as was often the case, the abbot of a particular monastery was not willing to sell a codex, or when the fathers could not afford to meet the price that was demanded of them, and when they could not receive a codex as a gift, which sometimes did happen that they did, they would then endeavor to borrow a manuscript and copy particular items that they were seeking. And then copies of particular odes, for example, would be sent back to San Lazzaro. Now, this renders the published versions of the odes published by the fathers in San Lazzaro, in some instances especially valuable, because they include passages and variants and readings that may have been drawn from manuscripts that have not survived. So they embody much information that may not otherwise be available to us. This is just the point of interest. Why do we need a new edition? Well, there are deficiencies, particularly with the 1981 edition. It does introduce us to new variants that were not known before, thanks to the very rich collection in the Madenataran Institute. But I do have considerable reservations with that edition. It leaves a lot of unsolved problems. It does not make use of Venetian manuscripts, including manuscripts that were not available to the Mkhitarist fathers, not even for their later 1840 edition. The editions completely ignore clues afforded by the pneumatic notation. The pneumatic notation was ignored by everybody because we can't understand the Numes, we cannot look at them and sing the melodies. So they were ignored. I shall demonstrate a little later why the Numes, in fact, can be useful to us. For instance, in distinguishing or in assessing the relative merits of mutually competing rival readings, and in telling us something about the structure of those pieces. Unlike the Soviet-era edition of the Book of Lamentation, the Madian Perkutian, which involved making use of a large number of manuscripts in a very transparent way, and which was done with considerable understanding, because although the editors were not theologically educated particularly, nonetheless they were able to avail themselves of various commentaries which were extremely helpful. So they made such choices as they made in a comprehending manner. Unlike the Book of Lamentation, there were no commentaries or helpful works on the Odes. So much of the work had to be done inevitably in a conscientious but nonetheless rather mechanical manner. Whereas now we are in a far better position than we were in 1981 to understand much of those rather elusive and intriguing texts, which puts us in a much better position to establish the texts themselves. I have already referred to the three types of source, and now I shall proceed, if I may, to present you four particularly interesting and enjoyable odes that have been fascinating also from a research point of view. One of them is a very loved, very well-loved piece. It is quite popular amongst Armenians, particularly in a version transcribed by Archimandrite Komitas. It's called Havun Artenatsial, the fowl awoke, or the fowl awaking. The oldest extant source for this ode, indeed for any ode by St. Gregory, is a book of odes and litanies found at the Bibliothèque Nationale, number 79, Armenian manuscript, copied in Trazarg in 1241. And this source includes no fewer than 13 of the 21 or so odes of the saint, depending on how you count them, and depending on whether you include certain doubtful pieces in the canon or not. This manuscript is incidentally interesting in that you can immediately see what is a musical sign, what is a neume. So apart from this majuscule ho letter, everything else that is in red in the main body of the text is a musical sign. So all this and these are neumes, these are musical signs, whereas the black signs, they're Armenian letters. They pertain to the verbal text. There were some interesting aspects of the ode that until recently were not well understood. I shall read you the text, if I may. It's not very long. You can see how full of allegory it is. The fowl awoke, and watching the pagans, called unto the turtle dove, nurtured in love and beloved. Return, O thy Shulamite, to the shelter of the rock. Come, O bride, from the mountains of leopards, from the fields of rose. They come and gather at Ephraim of Bethel, rising up to the open space, to the vineyard of Cedron, treading the winepress, wine the color of Bozrah, having put wood in bread, slaughtered that which he offered up to the slaughter, mixing with wine, the mixture from sweet things. The cup was offered as a wedding invitation, Come, ye new peoples, eat of my bread and drink my wine, that ye may live through inexhaustible, endless eternity. Now, there were 2 points which were misunderstood, and you found these in volume after volume, anthology after anthology, translation after translation. The Armenian, rather than referring to the Shulamite, the lover, the girl, the bride in the Song of Songs, referred to what was misunderstood as being the Shunammite, because the Armenian name is Somnatsi, and Somnatsi was uniformly used in the Armenian translation to describe both the Shunammite, whom we find in Kings, in one instance, Abishag, King David's last wife, is described as Somnatsi, a Sunamite. And it was also a Sunamite woman whose baby had died but was resuscitated by the prophet. And the confusion probably originates from the Greek Septuagint, where we have Sunamitis, which is so close to Somanitis. So the Armenian fathers assumed it was the same name, and they rendered the Shulamite as a Somnatsi. The second point is also an interesting one, having put wood in bread. Argyal paid ihats in Armenian. That was misunderstood, and it was assumed even by a knowledgeable scholar such as Patriarch Karekin Khachadurian of blessed memory. In his translation, he assumes that wood was put in the oven to bake bread. It had not been noticed that in the encomium to the Holy Cross by the same author, by St. Gregory of Narek, there's a further reference about wood being placed in bread, and that's a reference to the book of Jeremiah, where there's a passage that says, they said, let us take him away from the land of the living by dint of putting the wood of death in his bread. And that is something that church fathers, including Tertullian and Justin the Martyr, have interpreted as being a reference to the crucifixion, the wood of death being the cross whereon Christ was crucified, and the bread of life, as per St. John's Gospel, being Christ himself. So this was a little misunderstanding that I'm very glad that I helped clear up also. But the main interest of this ode is it demonstrates the imagery. In the book of Proverbs, it is wisdom herself who mixes wine and invites those weak of mind to attend her wine gathering. But that is at the same time interpreted by St. Gregory of Narek clearly, because it's juxtaposed with the words of the institution. So it's interpreted as being the blood of Christ, as offered as in the form of Holy Communion to the faithful, securing them endless and eternal life. Now, let us turn to the music. This is the manuscript in the hand of Archimandrite Komitas, in the Limongian notation, in the new Armenian musical system devised early in the 19th century. And if I may, I shall briefly sing a little of it so that you can get a flavor of it. And so forth. So you can see it's highly melismatic, as musicologists say. In other words, you have a long melody that is sung over a single syllable of text. So were I to sing the entire ode in this manner, it would take quite a long time. So increasingly, liturgically, it does appear that the melodies became more and more ornate and melismatic, whereby, to fill the same amount of liturgical time, less and less of the text was copied out in later codices and early publications, since a couple of couplets would suffice to fill the need liturgically. Now, a very similar melody may be found for rather different Armenian hymns, bits of the Divine Liturgy. There's a version of the Sanctus that is sung to a very similar melody, and an ancient vestment hymn associated with Khachadur Daronatsi called Chorurt Chorin, O Mystery Deep. The fact that a very similar melody is used for three rather diverse sets of words could be taken to imply that the melody may be fairly old, but the dense melismas that you heard could not possibly correspond to the positions of the Numes here. And so we know that whatever those Numes represent, and this is a 13th century manuscript, as you know, it was very different to what Komitas wrote down. You could, I suppose, act as the devil's advocate and claim that Gomidas's melody is even older than the 1241 manuscript, but I fear that if you claim that, as some people doggedly do, the burden of proof on your shoulders would be an unbearable one, at least from my point of view. There are two other melodies that are less well known. The one on the left is from a Constantinopolitan manuscript I was able to photograph at the Church of the Holy King in Kadıköy, on the Asian side of Constantinople, Istanbul at present. And it uses only some of the words from the middle of that stanza, Tidelov Hetanosis, as you see. That's another interesting thing. It became possible, indeed fashionable, to adopt a little bit of the ode and just focus on a few words, perhaps in the middle of a sentence, and create an independent ode out of that and sing that in a liturgical context. Yet another version you can see on the right-hand side, but a discovery that I was particularly pleased about just before lockdown, when I visited the Venetian fathers in San Lazzaro. I was able to look at some manuscripts, and I found a version of which I knew, but which I had not dared hope that it might have survived, as I had not found it anywhere. I mentioned Minas Pezeshkian, the Mkhitarist father, who had assisted in devising the new musical notation used in Armenian sacred music early in the 19th century. He also wrote an until recently unpublished monograph entitled Music. And in that he discussed, amongst other things, various Armenian traditional modes, but also he discussed Eastern music and Ottoman makams. And in demonstrating the properties of a makam known as Acem Ashran, well known in classical Turkish music, by the way, he cited as an example the ode Havun Artanatsial by St. Gregory of Narek. But as my good friend and colleague, Dr. Aram Kerovpian, who published an edition of the Pezeshkian manuscript, noted in his footnotes, we do not know of any such version of the melody for this ode. Well, I managed to find precisely that in a manuscript transcribed by Father Leonce Dayan of San Lazzaro in 1934, as sung by Father Minas Nuri-Khan. And this melody does indeed correspond to the description of the makam Acem Ashram referred to by Father Minas Pezeshkian. Father Minas Pezeshkian and Father Minas Nuri-Khan probably did not know each other, but there were intermediaries who could have sung the melody and conveyed that melody and taught that melody to Father Minas Nuri-Khan, from whom Father Leonce Dayan heard the melody. So we have yet one more melody in our collection, which is delightful. But again, note with all these melodies, they cannot possibly correspond to the neumes because the distribution of the neumes over syllables of text is different. Indeed, we can observe that, generally speaking, we can have potentially three different layers of metrical structure in the odes of St. Gregory of Narek. The first metrical layer may be observed in the case of such odes as possess regular metrical structure. So the words on their own have a fixed number of syllables, line after line. And so, for example, we could recite Havun Artnatsial, Tidelov Hetanosis, Tsainer Dadragin, Sirase Nun Sirel Voin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But some of the odes lack regularity, and so the first layer of metrical structure is missing. The second layer of metrical structure, which sometimes reinforces such meter as may be found accruing from the words themselves, and at other times differs from them, is that which emerges from the medieval Numes, particularly when we apply Utidjian's conjecture about metrical values associated with Numes. Now, returning to the same ode and to the earliest extant source, sadly, we're not able to compute the combined duration of a chain of Numes such as this one here. But even if I distinguish between Utidjian's list of long Numes, such as this one, and short Numes, such as this one, and if I were pro tempore to treat this long chain as just a long Nume, we have a rather different meter. We have something like this. Havun artenatial tidelov setanosis zainer tateragin siras nun sireluin. There is a definitely discernible sense of regularity about this meter. It doesn't go against the natural meter accruing from the words. It reinforces it by dint of emphasizing certain syllables, by allowing the singer to linger for a longer time over those. And then there's a third layer of meter, that which accrues from the melodies that have reached us. But we've already seen that those melodies are at variance with whatever the Numes implied. What does that imply? Well, I'm afraid it probably suggests that the melodies that we've got are of much more recent vintage than the numated manuscripts. And the earliest numated manuscript, dating as it does from 1241, is already almost a quarter of a millennium more recent than the life of St. Gregory of Narek himself. So even that may be different to what the saint himself may have sung. Nonetheless, of course, the artistic value of the melodies that are extant is in no way diminished by the fact that they are highly unlikely to be of medieval vintage. There's one other thing that is worth pointing out with these long melismas on particular syllables, which is that they give the listener time to ponder. So imagine that Havun Artenatial may have been sung after the epistle reading and the Old Testament reading and the gospel being chanted, and it would have enabled, as the ode itself does, the contents of the Old Testament reading, the epistle and the gospel to be linked to each other in a very satisfying way. And in that sense, one could argue that some of the odes are themselves exegetical works, by juxtaposing things from different scenes, different parts of scripture, different historical eras. They were perhaps intended to allow the faithful, even as they listened to the music being chanted, to associate one with the other. And there's a lovely sentence written by the late Archbishop Boharian of Jerusalem of blessed memory, saying that often as one listens to these long melodies over a single syllable of text, it is as if the words are melting into the music. They're being united with each other. My second example is an ode dedicated to the church, but also dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And it consists of two parts, and indeed in many manuscripts, it's considered to be two separate odes rather than a single ode. The second part starts with the rather romantic sounding words, her eyes, sea beside sea, overflowing with abundant smiles in the morning as two flashing suns, and so on and so forth. There may be a reference to a tradition whereby St. Gregory on the island Arder in Lake Van had a vision of the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus in her lap, something that we find portrayed in these relatively late manuscripts. The one on the left is a prayer scroll, an amulet. The one on the right is a manuscript of the Book of Lamentation, where you can see the saint having his vision. The text, which I shall present to you in a moment, is exceedingly beautiful, and it has the Virgin Mary personifying the church in both senses, both in the sense of a building and in the sense of the community of the faithful. There's a reference to a picture for the reed sapling, which is reminiscent of Armenian mythology and the pagan god Vahakan, who was sung as being born as a smoking and flaming reed, representing the incarnation. The Virgin Mary served as the pitcher in which the vulnerable reed sapling, namely the body of Jesus Christ, was able to grow and mature. And a small realization of which I'm rather proud is that in some of the earliest codices, there's a reference to the elm and vine, but it is something that was misunderstood even by scribes who crossed it out. And it, of course, is another piece of similar imagery, because in antiquity, elm trees, which themselves are devoid of fruit, served as frames around which vines could find support and grow. And of course, vines, again, if we look at the Gospel according to St. John, Christ refers to himself as the vine that gives life. So again, it's a reference to the Virgin Mary as serving as a receptacle in which the body of Christ grew, as an instrument enabling the incarnation. This ode also has intriguing references to a ray of light beaming down from the high window, a perfectly realistic scene in Armenian churches, also something that is evocative of sundials that are found on church walls, but also a reference to an important feast, the Feast of Shoragat, a feast of the dripping of the rays of light, as you can see portrayed on the right-hand side in the middle by this illumination in a Vienna hymnal. St. Gregory is believed to have had a vision in which Christ descended as a ray of light and with a luminous golden hammer indicate the plan of his church, the Church of Haig Utidjian, which literally means the monogenes, the only begotten, descended. And there's an emphasis on beauty and wisdom, which is not something that should shock us, because there are several instances of desirable women in the book of Proverbs and the sapiential books of the Bible, so there is nothing scandalous or unbehovely by that. Now, I shall present, before I present the entire text, this is one of the best sources for the Odes of St. Gregory I have encountered. It's a 1348 codex found in San Lazzaro, and you see the first part, a wondrous or an amazing song, is here, and Achkans of her eyes, sea beside sea, dense with smiles or laughter, starts here. But in other sources we find this appearing as an independent and separate ode. Now, the interesting thing is that this ode, if we look at the words, it does not have regular rhythm. It seems to be prose, lines of different lengths. And yet another ode by St. Gregory of Narek, Anun Anerin Ein Astvadze, the name of the existent is God, has the same neumes. If you look at these long syllables, So the same melody would have been sung. Many of the other neumes are the same, but they're not identical because they have to account for the fact that we have differing numbers of syllables. So the slack had to be taken up somehow. But it is rather surprising that an ode by St. Gregory that is in regular meter would have been sung, it seems, largely, essentially to the same melody as an ode that is written as prose. This ode is really remarkable. It differs from the saint's other Marian works, and it's very, very, very original. A very interesting Armenian source from the middle of the 6th century regarding Marian devotion is a homily by Peter of Synik, where he incorporates a catalogue of biblical passages deemed to apply to Mary. She is referred to as paradise planted by God, a pleasant vineyard, the burning bush, the golden urn, a vessel of fragrant incense, and so on and so forth. And yet in this ode, St. Gregory of Narek has devised metaphors that are strikingly original. And this ode by St. Gregory served to inspire generations of Armenian writers and musicians up until the middle of the 19th century. This is Professor Abraham Deryan's translation of the second part of the ode, which, as I mentioned, appears as an independent ode in many manuscripts. This is a historic recording. It only lasts a couple of minutes, and I shall play it to you, if I may. It's sung by Iris Bulbulyan with an accompaniment by Arab Artevyan, a pupil of Komitas, to allow you some time to savor the words before we proceed briefly to our next ode. I stress, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not a medieval melody. It could not possibly have been. But isn't it remarkable that, as we saw, the same melody was intended to have been sung to words that are in prose and which pertain to feminine beauty, words that are really almost, one might say, sensual, as also to that other ode I briefly showed you. The name of the uncreated existent is God, you know, with rather philosophical and abstract words. I find that rather surprising and quite remarkable. But we pass on to my next example very briefly, the Ode of the Little Cart. This is the ode for which it was thought that the earliest source was the 1513 publication, which was deemed to be earlier than known manuscripts. I was very fortunate in finding, however, some older codices in San Lazzaro, and I was able to reconstruct and add certain additional stanzas. So the end result is fascinating. There's this vision of a creaking wooden cart that is, on the one hand, coming down from Mount Massis. On the other hand, it's an immobile, surreal chariot corresponding to Ezekiel's vision that is supported by the angels. So on the one hand, you get this creaking cart proceeding from Massis to Jerusalem. On the other hand, this superb and indescribable celestial chariot. And St. John the Baptist, again, there's a pun of words because in Armenian he's referred to as Garabed, the forerunner. However, with a slightly different spelling, it's Garabed would be the person who is, as it were, driving the cart. And this metaphorical cart or chariot is passing through different eras. The apostles are encountered. We go through we witness scenes from the Song of Songs. Let me into the house of wine, heap apples upon me, which represent good works, according to St. Gregory's own commentary. But there was a line that was misunderstood. There are cues in this ode to the Armenian canonical hymnal. And both in the 1513 publication and in manuscripts, scribes wrote, or the editor wrote, the opening words of the hymn, expecting that the cue would be understood, whereas modern translations and editions seemed not to appreciate that fact. So instead of the Myrophore women, the women who brought spices and perfumes to the tomb of Christ, we get the rather odd result that it is the wheels and the axis of this cart that are exuding the perfume. I have published extensively on this ode, so I shall not go into further details, but it is a superb example and it can compete with surreal poetry from the beginning of the 20th century. It is astonishingly modern and very, very rich. Here you can see the three hitherto unused manuscript sources that I found in San Lazzaro, which enabled me to add several stanzas to the received text of this ode. And this is Gomidas's transcription on the left-hand side in the Limongian notation, the New Armenian notation system, and on the right-hand side, a fair copy. Again, we owe Gomidas this melody, and had he not transcribed it, in the case of this ode, there would have been no other melody known to us. My final example, it starts as a paraphrase to the Song of Songs, Nigra sum siavem keretsig, but then it sort of pivots into an ode that marks the nativity. Here, the Tendesian principles come into their own because we don't know any melody for this ode, but let us see what happens if we apply the Tendesian principles. A clear structure emerges. We've got couplets, but there's a kind of reverse enjambement. In other words, you find that within the end of a couplet is embodied already the opening of the next couplet. So metrically speaking, the second couplet or the subsequent couplet is built into the end of the current couplet. And though the numbers of syllables of each couplet may vary, if we use Untitled principles, we find that we've got a uniform meter, which is like this. Siavem keretzig tus trievai Jerusalem ahana har snim zangali. So it's down, pam, pop, pop, pam, di, ram, pam, pam, and so on. There is only one place where the Untitled principles do not allow us to achieve this regularity, and we've got an outsize line here. And fascinatingly enough, that very point is where groups of scribes disagree with each other, and so we've got this most fundamental division into our two fundamental groups of codices. This stemma I've devised on the basis of some 20-25 codices that I've been able to inspect so far, mostly in Venice and Vienna, but also some photographs I was able to purchase from the Maderataran Institute. Why is it that we have this, this bifurcation in the stemma where we encounter a loss of metrical regularity, notwithstanding the pneumatic notation? I suspect that at this point, the sources that were made available to the scribes may have been corrupted somehow, and two different scribes in two different places chose to adopt a different solution to cope with the situation. But the price that had to be paid was that if, for example, you chose to adopt some words from a line of which the beginning was utterly illegible, you would end up with a line that was too long, and so musical regularity would have to be sacrificed. But, you know, one feels a little like Sir Isaac Newton, who says that all we are noticing at this stage, it's the tip of the iceberg. It's that, you know, the odd sea shell or one stone at the beach is a little different from the other, but the treasures of the ocean still remain to be discovered. So there is much work that deserves to be done with these odes. And also, sadly, given that the oldest manuscript available to us is already some 250 or so years newer than the saint's own era, it is possible that we may never be able to reconstruct with certainty some of these texts. So I conclude, I've been trying to deal with three aspects which are distinct but closely related to each other. The aspects are the words, the verbal text of the odes, the pneumatic notation, those symbols of which the musical meaning we do not know, but which give us some interesting hints, and the melodies, which we've got only for some 6 or 7 of the odes. These odes really ought not to be neglected. They demonstrate a rather different aspect of the author's genius to that which we have manifest in the Book of Lamentation, a much more luminous, a much more joyful, a much more ecstatic aspect, with remarkable poetry, with multivalent symbolism and imagery, and we can clarify the text by having recourse to the corpus of works by the saint as a whole, and by having the Armenian hymnal and Holy Scripture at hand to clarify obscurities. The Numes can help us with textual criticism, and although the numations may come from a later period that may or may not be attributed to the author, I mean, the numations may or may not be attributable to the author, nonetheless, they can be helpful, they should be exploited, they play a role in exposing the meter, and finally, the extant melodies could not possibly correspond to the Numes, since the distribution of melodic fragments over verbal text appears to differ from that of the chains of Numes we find in particular places. We don't really have reliable criteria to judge the age of the melodies that we've got, But I continue to be of the opinion that the artistic value of those melodies is very considerable despite the lack of antiquity of these melodies. Let us not forget, after all, that those melodies have survived a process of filtration, recomposition throughout a millennium or so, reflecting evolutions in taste and reflecting the endeavors of many musicians, most of whom will, of course, remain nameless for us. I shall conclude my talk by citing two very important lovers of the oeuvre of St. Gregory of Narek. One was the Venetian Father Gabriel of Utidjian, who, in his commentary on the Book of Lamentation, in connection with his commentary on the Book of Lamentation, he wrote something that applies to the Odes to no lesser degree, namely that the height as well as the depth of this admirable artistic work ever exceed the length of chord of any seeking to measure it. And the other is the Constantinopolitan Patriarch Haig Utidjian, who wrote, "To those holy words of gold I gave explanations of copper, or to a palace of diamonds I provided gates of clay." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience and for tolerating my very modest gates of clay to those words of gold and diamonds. I do urge you to explore further these volumes by Abraham Terian, Michael Papazian, as well as my own very small contribution, may help you to find out more. And I should like to express my sincere gratitude to all those individuals and organizations, and not least to Dr. Tim Greenwood and the University of St. Andrews for hosting this event. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Okay, Haig, thank you so much for that. I'm now going to stop the recording